First of all, what zero represents is Joe Biden's understanding of the U.S. economy, because he has no clue what's going on. You can't brag about the fact that we had one lone month where high prices didn't get any higher. It's not like they went down. They just didn't go up. But if people were struggling with high prices, their struggle didn't get any easier in the month of July. It remained the same. What would have been good is if prices could have come down, but they didn't come down. And in fact, the only reason that the headline number didn't go up was because we finally got some relief at the pump. Gas prices came down, but a lot of other prices, food prices keep going up, rents keep going up. In fact, you mentioned the core, yes, which doesn't include energy, was up 0.3 on the month. So if you annualize that, multiply it by 12, that's still a pretty decent sized number. Yes, it's not quite as huge as the numbers we've been getting, but there's always going to be an ebb and flow in these numbers. I mean, how many times last year did all these analysts, including people in the government, claim that we had peak inflation? I mean, I got sick and tired of hearing peak inflation back in 2021. I had to keep saying we're nowhere near the peak. And the same thing applies today. Yes, we may have hit a temporary peak. Maybe it'll take a few more months before we see a year-over-year increase that's higher than the 9.1 that we got in June. But there's no doubt in my mind that we will get a higher number than 9.1. We are nowhere near done with this inflation problem. It is going to be here for years and years and years, probably the remainder of this decade, and probably then some. And, so just looking at one-off month where, we didn't get a big rise and having this premature victory dance, I think is an insult to the American public. I was predicting the U.S. economy would be in recession in the first half of 2022, and very few people had that right. But I also predicted that inflation wasn't transitory, that it would get stronger as the economy got weaker, and that is exactly what happened. Now, the reason that I believe that inflation is going to kick into a higher gear as this recession that we are in gets worse is because I believe Powell is going to pivot ultimately, and he is going to give up his fight against inflation in order to fight a different foe, and that is going to be a recession and rising unemployment and potentially a financial crisis, either one that has already happened or one that is rapidly approaching. And so I think Powell is going to choose what he believes to be the lesser of the two evils. And I think he's going to pick fighting recession and propping up financial markets and monetizing government debt so the Treasury doesn't have to default. I think the Fed is going to pick that over inflation. And so unlike the pivot that we got with Volcker back in 1982, where Volcker pivoted after a victory in his fight against inflation, Powell is going to pivot despite defeat. Inflation is going to win. And so when we go back to 0% interest rates or whatever we do, and when we go to QE5, which is going to be launched, I don't think the Fed is going to shrink its balance sheet very much. It's going to shrink it less than it did last time it tried to do it, which is an impossible task given the bubble that it's inflated. I think when the Fed goes back to stimulus and creating inflation, when inflation is maybe double or triple or quadruple that 2% target, the markets are going to react very differently than how they reacted in the past. Because in the past, the Fed was able to justify all this cheap money because they said we don't have enough inflation. We're still below target. Well, when they go back to this stimulus, when inflation is triple or more their target, the markets aren't going to buy it. And so I think all the inflation that they are going to have to create in order to stimulate the economy out of this recession is going to ignite a powder keg. They wanted to pretend they could get it for nothing or that somehow the rich would pay for it. But the rich aren't paying for it. The middle class and the working poor are paying for it, but they're not paying for it honestly through increased legitimate taxes. They are paying for it dishonestly through the inflation tax. But the main reason the government loves to pay for stuff with the inflation tax is because it never accepts responsibility for levying that tax. Instead, it blames it on other factors,
like greedy businessmen gouging their customers, or Vladimir Putin, or OPEC, or any other convenient scapegoat. And then what does government do? Government says, oh, now we need more laws and more regulations to protect the public from inflation. Government is the source of all this inflation, yet the government uses the inflation it creates as a springboard to even more government power. This is Black Friday, the day that officially kicks off the holiday shopping season, where Americans are supposed to go out and buy stuff. And this is considered economic activity in the United States. The fact that we go out and buy things, most of the stuff that Americans buy for Christmas, we didn't make. All this stuff is imported, and so it's only possible because of the economic growth outside the United States, not inside the United States. All we're doing is creating money, and we're exporting our inflation to the rest of the world in exchange for their goods. I mentioned about the holiday Black Friday, where Americans are out there shopping. The problem with Americans is we're consuming and not producing, and nowhere is that more evident than when you look at the ports. Because I mentioned that one of the things that Dubai has as an economic advantage is where it's located, and they're able to have a port. They have several ports, but their largest port is the 11th largest port in the world. And the reason that this port does so much business, it's not that Dubai is manufacturing so much stuff that it's exporting. What Dubai does is it imports and then re-exports a lot of stuff because of how efficiently it operates and because of the lack of duties. But I thought I would take a look just to put this in perspective when it comes to ports. Of the top 10 ports in the world, China has the number 1 port, and it has 6 of the top 10 ports in the world, and it has 16 of the top 50 ports. The top port in the United States ranks number 17, and America only has 4 of the top 50 ports. Yes, the population of China is a little over 4 times greater than the population of the United States, and so they roughly have 4 times the number of ports that we have in the top 50, but they have 6 ports in the top 10, and we don't even have 1. Plus, even though China has a huge population, the per capita income in America dwarfs the per capita income in China. You would expect a lot more ports in proportion to the population here in the United States than they have in China, and that's not true. And the main problem is, when it comes to ports in America, it's one-way traffic, because stuff comes in, but the containers leave empty, and so there's a lot of trade that doesn't take place. Whereas in China, not only does China import a lot, but it exports a lot, and so the volume of the trade is much greater. Maybe we should move a little slower and give the markets a little more time to react to the hikes that we've already put in place.
So we're going to see inflation moving up to a much higher level, even though it's already very high. In fact, it's probably double what the government claims in the CPI. If you want to know what's actually happening to prices, you've got to double what the government tells you, and that's more accurate. The data isn't lying. We have fewer people working than we had 4 months ago. You know, Biden claimed that we have a record number of people in the workforce. He was mistaken. He's wrong. We had more people working 4 months ago than we have working now. So even though we've recovered the jobs that we lost prior to the pandemic, it's only because the same people have multiple jobs. We haven't recovered the workers. We still have a lot of workers that were working prior to the pandemic that haven't rejoined the labor force. We can't have a soft landing, because the soft landing means we avoid recession. So by that definition, we've already crashed.
At the rally in the stock market, but more important than the reaction in the stock market is the reaction in the currency market. The dollar got hit hard on Wednesday, and in fact, it's falling again here on Friday morning. Then I think we could really start seeing a weakening dollar, which again is going to be very problematic for the Fed, because the weakening dollar is going to put more upward pressure on inflation. And ironically, of course, the reason the dollar is weakening is because the markets think that the Fed is winning its fight against inflation, and so it won't have to fight as hard in the future. and that is removing the supports from beneath the dollar, causing the dollar to tank, and now the very inflation that the markets thought the Fed was making progress in fighting is actually going to get worse. So the Fed will be a victim of its own success when it comes to inflation. But when the markets perceive this, I think it's really going to accelerate the movement out of U.S. dollars and into alternatives. In fact, if you look at what's happening in the stock market itself, it's exactly what I've been forecasting with respect to the continued rotation out of momentum into value.
I'm not going to change the meaning of a word just to deny that we're not in something that we're in. But the point of that tweet is you have all these Keynesians that somehow believe that inflation is caused by economic growth. They also think it's caused by too many people working. They think there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. They think if there's not enough people unemployed, you're going to have more inflation, and the way to get rid of inflation is to put people out of work. All of this is Keynesian nonsense. Inflation is not caused by the private sector.